Hello, I'm Joanne Diaz,
And I'm Abram Van Ingen.
and this is Poetry for All.
And today we have a very special poem about Labor Day. Now, if you're like me, Labor Day means the end of summer and, I don't know, some hamburgers on the grill and some hanging out and maybe a little college football. But for a lot of people, especially going back in the day, it was more than just the end of summer and the start of fall. And Joanne, you actually did a little research on Labor Day and when it started and all that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Do you know my father makes Labor Day cards and sends them to my son?
For real.
He can't find them at the Hallmark store, so he makes Labor Day cards.
I love that.
It is his favorite and most important holiday, and every single time he sends a Labor Day card to my son, he includes a quote from Eugene Debs.
That's incredible.
He loves Labor Day. Why is it so important? Well, again, as you say, for many people, it's the last of the barbecues, the last of the pool parties, it's back to school. But let's remember that in the 1800s, in 1894, it became a federal holiday, and for many years before that, it was celebrated state to state. Many states had Labor Day parades, and it was really important because it was a day off for the laborers of America, the people for whom a day off was not a given. It was a holiday for the working masses, for those who eventually formed labor unions for skilled and unskilled workers, many of whom were immigrants and most of whom were very, very poor and lived in very unstable employment and housing conditions. So Labor Day, it's an extremely important symbolic federal holiday, and I love that we're going to read a poem about work to honor that.
And so the poem we chose is by the great poet of the laborers, Philip Levine, and this is a poem called What Work Is.
What work is. We stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. Forget you. This is about waiting, shifting from one foot to another, feeling the light rain falling like mist into your hair, blurring your vision until you think you see your own brother ahead of you, maybe 10 places. You rub your glasses with your fingers, and of course it's someone else's brother. Narrower across the shoulders than yours, but with the same sad slouch, the grin that does not hide the stubbornness, the sad refusal to give in to rain, to the hours wasted waiting, to the knowledge that somewhere ahead a man is waiting who will say, "No, we're not hiring today," for any reason he wants. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother, who's not beside you or behind or ahead, because he's home trying to sleep off a miserable night shift at Cadillac, so he can get up before noon to study his German. Works 8 hours a night so he can sing Wagner, the opera you hate most, the worst music ever invented. How long has it been since you told him you loved him? Held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide, and said those words, and maybe kissed his cheek. You've never done something so simple, so obvious, not because you're too young or too dumb, not because you're jealous or even mean or incapable of crying in the presence of another man. No, just because you don't know what work is.
Love this poem.
Yeah, me too.
Joanne, you actually knew Levine. How did you know Levine? What is he like? What was your experience with him?
Oh, he was my teacher. I studied with him at New York University many, many years ago. And he was a wonderful teacher. He was funny. He was an amazing editor, an excellent listener. And he was very well known for taking poems that were in draft form in the poetry workshop. And I remember this so vividly, even with my own poems. I'd bring in like a 40-line poem and we'd read it aloud, and I'd think I did a great job. And he'd say, the first 15 lines and the last 15, you don't need those. You just need the 10 lines in the middle. And I'd be devastated. Awesome. And then I'd go home, I'd put it away for a week, and I'd be like, oh, he was right.
Yeah.
He was right. Yeah. But for him, what he was doing there, and this is hard, right? Is sometimes it's hard to know where a poem is supposed to begin and where it's supposed to end. And quite often, he was able to, with like a laser beam precision, he was able to find the heat of the poem. You know what I mean? And that's interesting to watch a great poet and editor do that. And it helps me understand his poetry too, because his poetry, every sentence is all heat all the time. I think that's very, very interesting to see.
Thinking about beginnings and endings, I mean, we were just talking about this, but where this poem begins and where it ends is so radically different. And we go on this incredible journey through this guy's mind, but where the poem begins is, you know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. And the last line of the poem is, because you don't know what work is. So I think one of the things we need to talk about today is how do we get from that beginning to that ending in this incredible poem?
Yes, and to answer that question, there's a lot of ways to answer it. What interests me is perspective. He's very interested in the perspective of whoever is reading this poem, but that you that he's addressing is also partly an I. It's also partly himself. And so I think that's the magic of this poem. And as we go through it, I think we'll see how that evolves.
Do you think the you engages the reader in a way that an I could not?
Oh, absolutely. This is an amazing sleight of hand. He makes it seem easy and simple and natural, but it is not. So if it were just, as you say, if it were just the first person's perspective, him speaking of his own experience, it would be a beautiful poem. It would still be amazing, but it would be very much a private utterance, his personal experience, his own interiority. Because he shifts it to the you, it challenges the reader, it implicates the reader, it forces you to visualize your own relationship to work and to the people in your life in a very interesting way. That's right.
He's got this famous, almost mission statement that is quoted almost every time people talk about Philip Levine, where he says to Detroit Magazine, I saw that the people that I was working with were voiceless in a way. And as young people will, I took this foolish vow that I would speak for them. And that's what my life would be. And sure enough, I've gone and done it, or I've tried anyway.
What you see is that through line throughout all of his work. He is always looking for the person who is least represented, especially as it relates to labor, especially as it relates to exploitation, not just in the United States, but abroad as well. And he just was interested in world labor and what labor means to ordinary people. And we know this about his biography. He started work as a teenager in the automotive industry in Detroit. He didn't remain there forever, but it shaped him in his young life, and it shaped his mission as a poet.
Yeah, it's an earned voice that he writes with. I mean, he grew up in Detroit, born in 1928, and started work at the age of 14 in the factories. And, continued doing various kinds of industrial and manual labor up into his 20s. But it's an earned voice. It's a world he knew well, and it's a world he dedicated his life to making vivid and giving voice to.
That's beautiful. And, yes, so much of his work is about manual laborers. And maybe as people hear us talking about that, maybe they're like me, just pushing buttons on a laptop all day long. And, I have a pretty soft life, Abram. I'm going to tell you, I'm pretty soft. I just sit around all day and read things and push buttons. That's all I do. But you know what? And a lot of people have office jobs who might be listening to this. Maybe some people listening to this might think, yeah, maybe this isn't a poem for me. But Abram, did you read Roxane Gay's article that she would write for the New York Times business section on Sundays?
No, tell me about it.
she was the featured writer who would write an advice column for the New York Times business section. And I think it was called The Work Friend. And she wrote her final article last week. I was quite moved and sad because she kind of gave a retrospective of all the advice that she had given to people, and she was very good at it. And like Philip Levine, very empathetic, very caring, and also very honest. And she said, we shouldn't have to suffer or work several jobs or tolerate intolerable conditions just to eke out a living. But a great many of us do just that. And there's more. I mean, there's more that she goes on to say in this article, and we can link it on our website. But it really reminded me that what Philip Levine is doing in this poem is not just a poem from early to mid-century, 20th century America. It's not just an assembly line poem. This precarity, this difficulty surrounding labor, this is something a lot of people in America feel every day to this day.
Absolutely. That's right. So let's get into this poem and talk about the structure of it and how it works. So this is one long column. It's sometimes called stick-it poems. There's only one stanza. You got to stick it in the one stanza. But also this one long stanza enables you to have the feeling of a kind of stream of consciousness. Where is his mind going as he waits? And it's filled with this sort of rich, almost photographic imagery, right? So we stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park. It's very descriptive. It's very specific. It begins there and then goes into his mind and starts to transition from one thing to another. So what do you make of the form and structure of this poem?
I love it. I love everything in those first two lines. Look at what genius this is. We stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. Stanley Kunitz was another great American poet, and I've probably used this quote before on this podcast, but he has a famous quote where he said that every line of poetry should feel like a Station of the Cross. And what he meant by that was every line really has to contain essential narrative and lyric information. So, first line, we stand in the rain in a long line. So already you know it's a collective we. Already you know that they are exposed to the elements. It's a lousy day, rain or shine, they are there in a long line. So this is going to require patience. Second line, waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. There's only one place they could be, Detroit, Michigan, Ford assembly plant, for work. There's only one reason they're there. So already you know so much narratively about the we.
And then, third line, you get a you. You know what work is. And here the you feels like the reader, right? Like me. You know what work is.
Yes.
If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. And then this wonderful thing in the next line, forget you.
Yeah.
This is about waiting. So there's a way in which he's almost tempting us to say, oh, I get it. You're waiting for work. And then he says, no, you don't get it. This is not about you. Forget you. This is about waiting, shifting from one foot to another. And it's there. The next time we see you, it's more of an I. It's a both, right? It's asking us to identify with someone else and to see work in a very different way. Work as waiting in line.
Isn't it audacious for a poem to say, forget you?
It's amazing.
I thought I was here to read a poem. Oh, wait, it's already dismissing me. But that's, again, the genius of Philip Levine. He's not afraid to contradict. He's not afraid to challenge or argue or subvert an expectation and then subvert it again within the same poem. It's very, very interesting. It demands your attention, and it really makes you listen.
And then the rain and the waiting makes him think that he sees his brother. And so one of the things I see happening here is the collective we becomes a kind of family. Yes, it's not his brother. He corrects himself. But there's a way in which he's starting to see in these people around him, that could be my brother. That could be my brother. This could be my brother.
Oh, that's beautifully put. I love that. And I love that he really slows us down. What really interests me is the waiting. The sad refusal to give in to the rain, to the hours wasted waiting. The poor and the working poor have to wait. The hours that they spend waiting, how all-consuming those hours are. And the lack of control that these workers have over their lives in this particular passage of the poem, I feel like that still has relevance to workers to this day, especially to workers who are beholden to people in power who get to say yes or no. And that precarity and instability, the way he focuses on that in that passage of the poem, I think that that really has relevance to this day. It's very, very powerful.
So now we have this radical transition. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother. How do we get there?
Oh my God. Isn't that amazing? Does that break your heart or what?
That's amazing.
It's beautiful. And I think that that's an example of Philip Levine's ability, and he does this in so many poems, that ability to leap with agility from the broad, the public, the socioeconomic, the political, very quickly to the personal. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother who's not beside you or behind or ahead because he's home trying to sleep off a miserable night shift at Cadillac so he can get up before noon to study his German. Works 8 hours a night so he can sing Wagner, the opera you hate most, the worst music ever invented. There's something that's so beautiful and affectionate here, also a little bit humorous, also do you feel that, right?
The opera you hate most. He's doing this terrible, terrible music, and yet you love him.
Music. Yeah, you love him, but what does it mean for him to be studying German, to sing the opera you hate most? And of course that's his point of view, but why is that an interesting point of view? And why does that leap out at you?
I mean, what leaps out to me here is his brother has earned the same respect, has stood in the same lines, has worked in the same kind of industry, has worked for Cadillac in the night shift, and yet his brother has his other kind of work as well. And this is where the poem starts to shift into the title of the poem, What Work Is. What is work? Yes, it is working in these automotive plants, but also work is waiting. And also work is getting up before noon to study German. And work is working on your singing. And if you think about this in the context of Philip Levine, who both worked in these industrial plants and wrote poetry, that is work too. He understands that poetry is also a kind of work. And this is where the poem is beginning to shift into getting us to think much more broadly about what work is.
You know what's beautiful about that is I completely agree with the reading that you just offered of that studying of German, of that singing of Wagner. But you know what? Even for someone who reads this poem and isn't a poet or isn't an artist, for me, that Wagner and that studying of German can also be read as what work can enable us to do that can make us feel a kind of freedom. Have you ever had this experience? I know I have thousands of times where you think you know someone in a work context, and then you meet them outside of work and you learn about their relationship to their family or what they do in their time after work, and then they're a whole other person. And I feel like we have to remember that too, is that work enables so much of what can be possible in our lives. And at least for this brother, that's what he wants to do that makes him be a possible other kind of identity, you know?
And where the poem ends is on the love for all that his brother is, and on the way that relationships themselves are a kind of work. And it's a work that we don't often think about. Do you know that I have a Substack column I write called A Rich Life? You maybe don't know that.
Yeah, I love that Substack, yeah.
The reason for talking about it is I wrote a column recently on the way that relationships both are the most rewarding thing in life and the most inconvenient thing in life. They demand time of you, they demand work of you, they demand sacrifices, and yet all the science of happiness reveals that true happiness over the long term depends so much more on relationships than it does on anything you might think, like fame, success, glory, money, whatever. Anyway, this is just to say relationships are themselves a kind of work, and we see that at the very end. It's a work that on the one hand is so simple, say this thing, I love you, and on the other hand is a work that he hasn't done.
Wow. That's really helpful. I had not thought about that. So can you read what you're seeing the final
Yeah.
gesture of the poem
So
doing?
here's how the poem ends. How long has it been since you told him you loved him, held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide and said those words, and maybe kissed his cheek? You've never done something so simple, so obvious, not because you're too young or too dumb, not because you're jealous or even mean or incapable of crying in the presence of another man. No, just because you don't know what work is.
Wow. There's the power of the you again, right? Because don't you see this as another kind of provocation? At the beginning of the poem, the provocation was forget you. Forget about
Yeah.
you. I don't have time
Yeah.
for you. I want to talk about work. And then by the end of the poem, he's kind of inviting the reader to be like, it's been a while, hasn't it? When's the
Yeah.
last time you recognize that you need to do this very seemingly simple thing? But it's not so simple, and you're not stupid. You're just forgetting that you have to do this, and this is a part of life, just like standing in line at Ford Highland Park is, right?
Yeah, so the poem moves from, you think you know what work is? No, you don't. Look at me waiting in line. This is work. This is not about you. This is about people waiting in line. Then it's about the people waiting in line becoming a kind of family. He sees his brother there. Oh, it's not his brother. What is his brother doing? Oh, his brother is singing, is working on German. That's a kind of work. And then as he's thinking about his love for his brother, he's realizing, I never tell that brother that I love him. That, too, is a kind of work. And I haven't done it because I don't know what work is.
Jeez. Okay, again, masterful. This is what Philip Levine, he's so well known for this in that narrow column of text, and you're going to see this in so many of his poems across years and books. That narrow column of text, you think he sets up a thesis or an argument, and then he subverts it, or he complicates it, or he turns it on himself and implicates himself. And I think that's the way he earns the trust of his readers. I think that's how he shows how honest he is, how imperfect he is, and it makes you want to read over and over again. There's a voice there that is so both authoritative and vulnerable. It's very difficult to strike that chord, but he does it. He lands every time, and it's just the best. He's the best. I love him.
So should I read this poem again?
I sure would love it if you would.
What work is. We stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. Forget you. This is about waiting, shifting from one foot to another, feeling the light rain falling like mist into your hair, blurring your vision until you think you see your own brother ahead of you, maybe 10 places. You rub your glasses with your fingers, and of course, it's someone else's brother. Narrower across the shoulders than yours, but with the same sad slouch, the grin that does not hide the stubbornness, the sad refusal to give in to rain, to the hours wasted waiting, to the knowledge that somewhere ahead a man is waiting who will say, no, we're not hiring today, for any reason he wants. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother, who's not beside you, or behind you, or ahead, because he's home trying to sleep off a miserable night shift at Cadillac so he can get up before noon to study his German. Works 8 hours a night so he can sing Wagner, the opera you hate most, the worst music ever invented. How long has it been since you told him you loved him, held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide and said those words, and maybe kissed his cheek? You've never done something so simple, so obvious, not because you're too young or too dumb, not because you're jealous or even mean or incapable of crying in the presence of another man. No, just because you don't know what work is.
Oh my God, this poem, it's beautiful. Thank you for that reading, and thanks to Alfred Knopf for granting us permission to read this poem, which you will find in a wonderful book titled What Work Is.
We hope you like what you heard today, and if you did, please subscribe and leave a review and let us know how we're doing.
And please be sure to follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram, and our new YouTube channel.
Thanks all for listening.